As Anakin Skywalker's mind became increasingly warped and overcome by the dark side of the Force, he was forced to rationalize his horrendous actions during Order 66 and the Great Jedi Purge. While he was still rife with inner turmoil, the corruption of the dark side allowed him to convince himself that all of his actions were justified. Palpatine had convinced him that the Jedi were traitors to the Republic, and even though Anakin briefly felt remorse for what he had done, he was still resolute in his actions and their necessity. As explained in the novelization of Revenge of the Sith, Anakin believed that the Jedi needed to be destroyed in order to free the Republic from their treachery, and he was convinced that all corruption in the Senate was their fault. Additionally, he was manipulated into believing that the slaughter of the Jedi would increase his strength in the dark side, granting him the power to save Padme. As we know, Anakin caused Padme's death by his own hand and then was brutally defeated by Obi-Wan on Mustafar. So how did he still rationalize his actions after he had lost everything? His thoughts on the Jedi, Obi-Wan, and Padme are explained in the Legends novel Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, where we find him nearly completely overcome with the persona of the Sith Lord. Weeks after Order 66, Vader was still subjected to the manipulations of his new master. Sidious assured him that he had reached an important threshold in his journey, as he was finally free to make full use of his powers in the Force. He told Vader that without the two of them, the galaxy would never have been restored to order, and that Vader needed to embrace the sacrifices he had made to bring about that change and fulfill his destiny. After Vader was injured by a surviving Jedi's lightsaber on Murkana, he was overcome with self-doubt and anger at his apparent weakness in the Force after Mustafar. This caused him to ponder the events that led to his immolation on the lava bank, and is a perfect representation of his skewed perspective through the corruption of the dark side. Vader thought of his new suit of armor, and wondered if Sidious had deliberately engineered it to keep him subservient. Perhaps the armor was punishment for having failed on Mustafar, or maybe that failure had merely given Sidious an excuse to weaken him. Vader wondered if the promise of apprenticeship was nothing more than a ploy, when in reality Sidious only wanted another Grievous to command his forces in the new Empire. Vader dwelled on this thought, before coming to a conclusion that was even more disheartening. Sidious had sent him to Mustafar only to kill the members of the Separatist Council. It was Padme and Obi-Wan that had sentenced him to the Black Suit prison. He was sentenced by his wife and his alleged best friend, their love for him warped by what they had perceived as betrayal. Obi-Wan was too brainwashed by the Jedi to recognize the power of the dark side. Padme was too enslaved to the Republic to understand that Palpatine's machinations and Anakin's defection to the dark side had been essential to bringing peace to the galaxy. Essential to placing power in the hands of the resourceful enough to use it properly, in order to save the galaxy from themselves and end the incompetence of the Senate. It was necessary to destroy the bloated, entitled Jedi Order, whose masters were blind to the decay they had fostered. Vader wondered why the Jedi hadn't followed him in embracing the dark side, if he was supposed to be their chosen one. His rage began to grow inside as he thought of himself burning on Mustafar. He had only wanted to save Padme from death and Obi-Wan from ignorance. In the end, they had failed to recognize his power, to accept that he was doing what was best for everyone. Instead, Padme was dead, and Obi-Wan was running for his life, as stripped of everything as Vader was. Enraged, Vader cursed the Force itself. What had it ever brought him besides pain? It tortured him with foresight, with visions that he was unable to prevent. It led him to believe that he had great power when he was really little more than its servant. He promised himself that would not be true any longer. Through the power of the dark side he would go forward, rendering the Force subservient to him. The burden of being heralded as the chosen one of prophecy was something that weighed on Anakin Skywalker's shoulders from the moment he was brought before the Jedi Council. Supposedly destined to bring ultimate balance to the Force, the Jedi believed that Anakin would fulfill the prophecy by destroying the Sith once and for all. Yet the true meaning of balance or the prophecy itself was interpreted differently by some, and that uncertainty would be reflected in Anakin's own path as he fell to the dark side and became the Sith Lord Darth Vader. Nowhere in the prophecy did it say that the Chosen One would be a Jedi, yet it would seem that Anakin would not bring balance to the Force at all as a Dark Lord of the Sith. Interestingly enough, Vader's own thoughts on the prophecy, his supposed role as the Chosen One, and the Jedi Order are explained in the Legends novel Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader. A few weeks after his defeat on Mustafar, Vader meditated alone in his chambers, pondering all that had occurred during Order 66 and his confrontation with Padme and Obi-Wan on Mustafar. He wondered if he should cast blame on Palpatine for his injuries, but then realized that it was only Obi-Wan who had sentenced him to the prison of his armor. He was sentenced by his wife and his alleged best friend, their love for him warped by what they perceived as betrayal. Obi-Wan was simply too brainwashed by the Jedi to recognize the true power of the dark side. Vader knew that Palpatine's machinations and his own defection to the Sith had been essential to bring peace to the galaxy, essential to place power in the hands of those resourceful enough to use it properly, in order to save the galaxy from itself, to end the incompetence of the Senate, to dissolve the bloated and entitled Jedi Order, whose masters were blind to the decay that they had fostered. Vader wondered why he, their chosen one, had seen the truth, yet they had refused to follow his lead by embracing the dark side. He thought that the Jedi were simply too set in their ways, too inflexible to adapt. Vader's rage grew inside as he thought of the prophecy and of the Force itself. He had simply wanted to save everyone, yet they were too blind to see it. In the end, everyone had failed to recognize his true power, to accept that he knew what was best for them. Instead, Vader was stripped of everything he once was, left without a purpose. Vader cursed the Force, wondering what it had ever brought him but pain, torturing him with premonitions, visions that he was unable to prevent, leading him to believe that he had great power and was destined to bring balance, when he was really little more than the Force's servant. But Vader promised himself that he would be a servant no longer. Through his own strength and the power of the dark side, he would render the Force subservient to him. Vader then thought to himself that while Anakin Skywalker had died on Coruscant, the Chosen One had truly died on Mustafar. Now, I think that this look into Vader's mind is incredible, and it's why I recommend that every single fan read this book. I think that Vader's thoughts could be interpreted a couple different ways. Perhaps he viewed his role in destroying the Jedi Order and forming the Empire as him fulfilling the prophecy and balancing the Force. Maybe Vader believed that it was the Jedi that needed to be destroyed and not the Sith in order to bring balance. Or perhaps Vader was so bitter and full of self-pity that he blamed the Force itself for his pain, and he renounced the prophecy and his role as the Chosen One. Either way, it's fairly clear that after the rise of the Empire, Vader either considered the prophecy fulfilled or didn't care about it at all, meaning that he did not consider himself to be the Chosen One, since he told himself that the Chosen One had died on Mustafar. After he was defeated on Mustafar and rebuilt into a fearsome cybernetic warrior, Anakin Skywalker's mind was consumed by Darth Vader. Struggling with remorse, anger, and frustration over everything he had lost, Vader sought to completely forget his past, embracing the dark side of the Force and his role in the new Empire. Due to the corruption of the dark side, Vader held twisted views on the final days of the Clone Wars and his actions during the Jedi Purge. In the Legends novel Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, as he returned to the ruins of the Jedi Temple and saw the aftermath of his slaughter firsthand, Vader's thoughts on the Jedi and his own sins are revealed. Weeks after Order 66, Vader was instructed to visit the Jedi Temple by his master to search the archives for lost Sith holocrons. But Vader knew that Sidious truly wanted to rub his face in the aftermath of the slaughter that he had spearheaded. Though the corpses of Jedi had been removed and the spilled blood had been washed away, scorch marks on the walls and ceiling attested to the surprise attack of Operation Nightfall. Most of Anakin Skywalker's memories grew fainter inside Vader's head every day, but not Anakin's memories of what happened that night in the temple. Vader believed that the Jedi had simply been too brainwashed to recognize the true power of the dark side, to understand that Anakin's defection to the Sith had been essential for peace in the galaxy. He thought that the entitled Jedi Masters had become blind to the decay they had fostered, as they were too set in their ways, too inflexible to adapt. Vader considered the ruins of the temple on Coruscant to be the place that Anakin Skywalker truly died. He remembered kneeling before Sidious, being dubbed Darth Vader, and being told to march on the Jedi Temple. In his mind's eye, Vader saw himself and the 501st Legion march on the temple gates. He saw their wrathful attack, his mad moments of bloodlust, the dark side unleashed in all its fury through his blade. Some moments he remembered more clearly than others, like beheading the very masters that had instructed him, and of course his extermination of the younglings, and with them the future of the Jedi Order. He had wondered beforehand if he would be able to do it. New to the ways of the dark side, would he be able to call on its power to guide his hand and lightsaber? As an answer, the dark side had whispered to him that the younglings were orphans, without family or friends, and were better off dead, so he killed them. Vader knew now that he had not killed the Jedi to serve Sidious, though his master was meant to believe just that. In his arrogance, Sidious was unaware that Anakin had seen through him. Had the Sith Lord thought that he would simply shrug off the fact that, from the start, Sidious had been manipulating him? No, he hadn't killed the Jedi in service to Sidious, or even to demonstrate his allegiance to the Sith. He had obeyed Sidious's command to attack the temple because the Jedi would never have understood Anakin's decision to sacrifice everything to save Padme. More importantly, the Jedi would have attempted to stand in the way of the decisions he and Padme would have needed to make regarding the fate of the galaxy, beginning with the assassination of Sidious. He knew now that even if he had killed Sidious, winning the war single-handedly for the Republic, the Jedi would have fought him to the bitter end. They might even have insisted on taking custody of he and Padme's child, who would have undoubtedly been strong in the Force. Vader wished that the Masters on the Council hadn't been so set in their ways, so deceived by their own pride. Perhaps they would have grasped that the Jedi needed to be destroyed. Like the Republic itself, their order had grown stale, self-serving, and corrupt. And yet, if the Council had granted him the rank of Master, perhaps he could have abided their continued existence. But to call him the Chosen One only to hold him back, to lie to him and expect him to lie for them, what had they imagined the outcome would be? In his mind, Vader cursed the Council, regarding them as old fools. He understood now why they had discouraged the use of the dark side. It was because they had feared losing the power they enjoyed. The Jedi had been conspirators in their own downfall, complicit in the reemergence of the dark side, and as important to the victory of the Sith as Darth Sidious himself had been. As Vader continued his ruminations, his anger continued to build while he made his way through the temple. He was shaken by the effect of the memories on his still healing body. His heart pounded in his chest, and the respirator fed his heart's needs with rapid breaths. For his own health and sanity, he realized he would have to avoid places such as the temple that whipped his anger into such a frenzy. The recognition that he would never be able to set foot on Naboo or Tatooine caused an anguished moan to escape from his mask, and he stood alone in mourning. After suffering gruesome injuries on Mustafar, Darth Vader was forced to rely on a suit of life support armor to keep himself alive. While the loss of his limbs and him being burned alive is shown on screen, the full extent of his injuries is something fleshed out in the books. While his injuries obviously changed him physically, they also greatly affected his mental state and what he thought of himself. Vader's thoughts on his injuries and his armor are explained in the Legends novel Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, as he contemplates his existence a few weeks after the events of Revenge of the Sith. Vader was immensely frustrated by the physical limitations that the armor imposed upon him. His movement was hindered to such an extent that he could barely maintain a kneeling posture when speaking to the Emperor, and this enraged him. Weeks after Mustafar, Vader began to wonder if his suit was constructed poorly on purpose in order to keep him weak. Although Vader did not receive confirmation at that point, we know that it's absolutely true. Palpatine did make the suit as restrictive and painful as possible in order to ensure that Vader was strong in the dark side yet could not overthrow him. It's still very interesting to know that Vader suspected that himself. Vader felt incredibly bitter about his situation after the rise of the Empire, and he considered himself a mere minion, an alleged apprentice of the Sith. While he had retained his knowledge of the Jedi arts, he questioned his place within the Force, and feared that he could not sustain the power of the dark side in his new cybernetic state. He angrily thought of how the Force itself had humbled him by stripping him of everything he had, comparing himself to Darth Maul and Dooku, who were also humiliated and cast aside as Palpatine's plans unfolded. Vader resented his master, since he believed that while Palpatine had achieved victory and gained everything, he had lost everything, including the confidence and skill he had once held as Anakin Skywalker. As Vader adjusted to life inside his armor, he would bitterly think to himself that every single one of his movements was an abomination. He was perpetually dismayed by the incompetence of the medical droids that had rebuilt him into a machine. For his mechanical legs, the droids had used an inferior alloy instead of durasteel, and failed to inspect the strips of metal that covered the electrical wiring. As a result, the inner lining of his armor would constantly snag on his knee and ankle joints as he moved. The boots of the armor did not fit his mechanical feet, and they were raised in the heel, leaning him forward and forcing him to move with caution to avoid tipping over. It became so difficult for Vader to walk that he needed to call upon the Force for assistance, which infuriated him even more. His armor limited the movements of his mechanical arms so much that he couldn't even raise them above his head. While Vader knew that he could adjust the arms to deliver enhanced physical strength, he was not impressed by that, since he had always possessed the ability to crush anything through the power of the Force. Vader also felt a seething hatred for his mask and helmet, which he despised the design of. He felt that it was needlessly angular, and with the helmet attached, he had to crane his neck at nearly a 90-degree angle just to see his feet. Because his eardrums had melted in Mustafar's heat, sound waves were transmitted through implants inside his helmet, but they distorted everything as though he was underwater. Because the helmet's audio sensors were poor at distinction and isolation, Vader found it very difficult to comprehend the distance and direction of whatever he was hearing. Yet despite all of these limitations and failures, he considered the biggest flaw of his armor to be the breathing apparatus. From the control box that pierced through his chest, a thick cable entered directly into his torso, connecting the respirator to a heartbeat regulator. His chest also housed an implanted ventilator, with tubes running directly into his scorched lungs and throat. This additional tubing from the ventilator allowed him to breathe unassisted for a short time if his armor ever stopped functioning. Vader hated the chest control panel, believing that its flashing lights served as constant reminders of how vulnerable he truly was. With the beeping of the panel and the rasp of his respirator, he could barely rest inside the armor, which is why he preferred to sleep inside a bacta tank. The only time that he could consume food and drink through his mouth was when he retreated to one of his hyperbaric chambers. Otherwise, he would rely on nourishment through intravenous liquids. Additionally, since his burned body had needed to be covered in synthetic skin, Vader needed to have his entire body scrubbed and cleaned constantly to dispose of rotting flesh. While conforming to life inside his armor, Vader also developed claustrophobia as he longed to break free of the armor's restrictive shell. He considered living in the armor to be perpetual torture, and believed that his cybernetic existence was not truly life. Vader ultimately thought of himself as wreckage left behind by the Clone Wars, and he cursed Obi-Wan and Padme for confining him to the black armor. Thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and may the Force be with you.